The Galactic Council's most decorated military strategist just filed a resignation letter that consisted entirely of the words, "Nope, nope, nope," written 47 times in increasingly erratic handwriting. The reason? A small blue planet in the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm had just broken 3 galactic records: fastest colonial retreat, most psychiatric evacuations, and highest turnover rate for what should have been a simple subjugation mission. Commander Vex Thulon Gripnarch of the Corthaxian Supremacy stared at his reflection in the polished chrome surface of his command module, wondering where exactly his military career had taken such a spectacular nosedive. 6 months ago, he'd been the toast of 17 star systems. Now he couldn't look at a potted plant without breaking into a cold sweat. "Sir?" His aide, Lieutenant Ziff Grull Mumblethorpe, approached with the particular shuffle that military personnel develop when they're about to deliver catastrophically bad news. "The evacuation shuttles are, well, they're full again." Vexthalon closed his eyes and counted to 10 in 7 different languages, a meditation technique that had served him well during the Andromedan Rebellion. It wasn't helping now. Nothing helped anymore. Not since they'd discovered that humans consider deep-fried butter a delicacy and somehow managed to not immediately die from consuming it. "How many this time, Mumblethorpe?" 37, sir." Private Klepnorg started crying again when a human child offered him something called pop rocks. Apparently, the crackling sounds convinced him that his brain was being invaded by microscopic warriors. The worst part, Vexthalon reflected, was that the mission briefing had been so promising. Earth was inhabited by bipedal mammals with no apparent space travel capability, no energy shields, no plasma weapons, and certainly no formal military training that could threaten a species that had conquered half the galaxy with nothing more than superior organizational skills and really good spreadsheets. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was that these bipedal mammals had somehow evolved into the most inadvertently terrifying species in the known universe. The troubles had started the moment they'd entered Earth's atmosphere. The navigation officer, a competent fellow named Grixpool Flankenboscher, had been trying to locate a suitable landing site when he'd encountered something called Google Earth. The concept of a species voluntarily uploading detailed surveillance footage of their entire planet to a publicly accessible network had caused poor Grixpool to suffer what military psychologists would later classify as an ontological breakdown. "They want us to see where they live," he'd screamed, pointing at the screen with a trembling tentacle. "What kind of predator species advertises its own nesting sites? It's a trap!" It had taken 3 sedatives and a lengthy explanation from the xenocultural anthropologist to convince him that humans had simply invented global surveillance for the purpose of finding restaurants and avoiding traffic jams. The actual landing had gone about as well as could be expected, which is to say that it had been an unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. They'd chosen a pleasant-looking green space in something called Central Park, reasoning that the abundance of vegetation indicated a peaceful, pastoral setting suitable for establishing their forward command post. What they hadn't anticipated was that this peaceful location was home to approximately 14,000 humans engaged in activities that defied every known law of physics, common sense, and basic survival instinct. Within minutes of touchdown, they'd witnessed a human female jogging at speeds that should have caused immediate cardiac failure while wearing what appeared to be decorative torture devices on her feet. A human male had jogged past in the opposite direction, sweating profusely and grinning with the sort of manic enthusiasm typically associated with severe head trauma or religious ecstasy. "Why are they running?" Sergeant Plockniff Grumblewise had demanded, his voice reaching a pitch that shattered 2 coffee mugs in a nearby food cart. "What are they running from?" The answer, as it turned out, was absolutely nothing. Humans, they discovered, ran for something they called fun, which was apparently a recreational activity that involved deliberately causing themselves physical discomfort in pursuit of, well, no one could quite figure out what they were pursuing, but they seemed very determined to pursue it. But the joggers were nothing compared to what happened next. A group of humans had gathered in a circle nearby and begun engaging in an activity that the Corthaxian combat analysis computer immediately classified as ritualistic warfare preparation. The humans were moving in synchronized patterns, shouting in unison, and working themselves into what could only be described as a battle frenzy. "Combat positions," Vexthulon had ordered, and 63 highly trained soldiers had immediately assumed defensive formations around their landing craft. The humans, meanwhile, continued their mysterious ritual, occasionally breaking into individual displays of combat prowess that included spinning, leaping, and contorting their bodies into positions that should have resulted in immediate hospitalization. It wasn't until Private Snorfglig Dinglehopper had bravely volunteered to investigate further that they discovered the humans weren't preparing for war. They were doing something called aerobics, which was apparently a form of voluntary torture that they inflicted upon themselves every morning before going to work. The instructor, a blonde human female with the lean, dangerous look of a professional assassin, had noticed the approaching Corthaxian soldier and had immediately begun speaking to him in the sort of aggressively cheerful tone that in most species indicates imminent violence. "Hi there, first time? Great, just follow along, don't worry about keeping up, and remember to breathe." Poor Snorfglig had returned to the landing craft 20 minutes later, whimpering and occasionally twitching. When asked to report on his findings, he'd simply stared at the wall and whispered, "They call it burpees." The medical officer had sedated him on the spot. Things had gone rapidly downhill from there. The Corthaxians had attempted to establish their authority by setting up a perimeter around their landing craft, but this had only attracted more humans, who seemed to view the alien visitors as some sort of entertainment. A small human offspring had approached Corporal Whiffbang Snorglebottle, who was standing guard with a plasma rifle that could vaporize a small building. The child had looked up at the 7-foot-tall, heavily armed alien warrior and said, "Cool costume. Are you supposed to be like a space ninja or something?" Whiffbang, who had survived 3 galactic wars and countless battles against the most fearsome enemies in known space, had simply stood there making small whimpering sounds while the child proceeded to examine his weapon with the casual curiosity of someone investigating an interesting stick. "Does it light up? Can I see? My mom says I'm not supposed to touch other people's stuff, but this is so cool." The child's mother had eventually appeared and had apologized profusely while dragging her offspring away, but not before taking several photographs with a small device that she assured everyone would be perfect for social media. This had led to the second major crisis of the invasion, the discovery that humans possessed a global communication network that they used primarily for sharing pictures of food, arguing about politics, and posting videos of small domestic animals doing amusing things. Within hours of landing, 17 different videos of the Corthaxian landing craft had been uploaded to something called TikTok, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments. The xenolinguistics team had been tasked with analyzing these comments, and their report had made for disturbing reading. "Sir," Lieutenant Mumblethorpe had reported, his voice shaking slightly, "the humans seem to think we're either a viral marketing campaign or totally fake CGI. Several comments suggest that our invasion is mid and cringe, and someone with the username AlienHunterXX has offered to drop sick beats over our landing footage." "What?" Vexthulon had asked carefully. "Is a sick beat?" "We're still working on that, sir." The situation had deteriorated further when they'd attempted to establish communication with the local authorities. The problem was that Earth apparently didn't have local authorities in any meaningful sense. Instead, they had something called bureaucracy, which seemed to be a system designed to ensure that nothing important ever got done quickly or efficiently. Their first contact with human officialdom had come in the form of a park ranger named Dave Kowalski, who had approached their landing craft with all the concern of someone dealing with an illegal barbecue. "Excuse me," Dave had said, tapping on the hull of the spacecraft with his clipboard, "but do you folks have a permit for this?" The question had caused a minor psychological breakdown among the Corthaxian command staff. The concept that an invasion force might need to fill out paperwork before conquering a planet was so fundamentally alien that their onboard computers had briefly crashed while trying to process it. "A permit?" Vexthulon had eventually managed. "Yeah, for large gatherings in public spaces. Also, if that's a camping setup you've got there, you're going to need to pay the overnight fee. And I'm pretty sure that energy weapon violates about 6 different city ordinances." Dave had handed them a stack of forms through the airlock and had cheerfully explained that they'd need to submit everything in triplicate to the parks department, who would forward it to the appropriate authorities after a standard 6 to 8 week processing period. "But don't worry," Dave had added helpfully, "if you're here for the weekend, you can probably get a temporary permit. You'll just need proof of insurance, a notarized affidavit stating your intent to leave the premises in the same condition you found it, and 17 different signatures from various department heads." The Corthaxians had spent the next 3 hours staring at forms with names like Application for Non-Standard Recreation Equipment Usage and Environmental Impact Assessment for Potential Atmospheric Disturbance Events. The xenopsychologist had suffered a complete nervous breakdown when he'd realized that humans had somehow managed to weaponize paperwork. But the bureaucracy was nothing compared to what happened when they'd ventured outside the park to explore the surrounding area. The streets of New York City had proven to be a sensory nightmare beyond anything in their worst tactical simulations. The noise alone had been enough to send half the reconnaissance team into catatonic shock. Humans, it turned out, lived in a constant barrage of car horns, construction noises, sirens, music, shouting, and something called street performers, who made loud noises with various instruments in exchange for small metal discs. Private Gregson Booger Flipper had lasted exactly 17 minutes before he'd been found curled up in a doorway, rocking back and forth and muttering, "The sounds, they never stop. The sounds never stop." The smells had been even worse. Humans apparently consumed their food from mobile preparation units that generated aromatic clouds of grease, spices, and chemical compounds that the Corthaxian olfactory systems couldn't identify. The combination of hot dog carts, pizza stands, pretzels, and something called halal guys had created an olfactory assault that had overwhelmed their biological filters. Sergeant Plockniff Grumblewise had approached what appeared to be a food preparation specialist and had politely inquired about the nature of his wares. The vendor, a cheerful human named Tony Ramirez, had immediately launched into an enthusiastic description of his world-famous bacon cheeseburger with extra pickles. "See, what you got here is a half-pound of premium beef, grilled to perfection, topped with aged cheddar, crispy bacon, lettuce, tomato, onions, pickles, special sauce, all on a toasted sesame seed bun. Want me to make it a combo? Comes with fries and a drink." The concept that humans regularly consumed the flesh of multiple animals simultaneously, combined with fermented plant matter and chemically processed potato slices, had caused Sergeant Grumblewise to develop what the medical team later diagnosed as acute existential horror. They're apex predators," he'd screamed, pointing at a nearby human who was casually devouring what appeared to be a sandwich containing at least 4 different life forms. "Look at them eat. They're monsters." The human in question, a middle-aged accountant named Frank DeLuca, had simply nodded politely and had offered to share his pastrami on rye with the obviously disturbed alien visitor. This act of casual generosity had broken something fundamental in Sergeant Grumblewise's worldview. The idea that a creature capable of consuming multiple species in a single meal would voluntarily share its kill with a complete stranger was so contrary to everything the Corthaxians understood about predator behavior that it had required immediate psychiatric intervention. But the food situation had been merely the beginning of their troubles. The real horror had come when they'd witnessed humans engaging in their traditional recreational activities. A group of human juveniles had been playing something called dodgeball in a nearby playground, which the tactical analysis team had immediately identified as combat training for child soldiers. The sight of young humans hurling spherical projectiles at each other with obvious glee, while their adult supervisors watched approvingly, had convinced everyone present that they were dealing with a warrior culture of unparalleled savagery. "They're training them from infancy," Lieutenant Zifgrel Mumblethorpe had reported, his voice cracking with terror. "The adults are teaching the young ones to attack each other for sport." The situation had become even more disturbing when they'd observed a group of adult humans engaged in something called basketball. The sight of fully grown predators leaping through the air while fighting over possession of a spherical object had convinced the Corthaxian observers that they were witnessing some sort of ritualistic combat tournament. The fact that the humans seemed to be enjoying themselves had only made it worse. "Sir," Corporal Whiffbang Snorglebottle had whispered, "I think they like fighting each other." "That's impossible," Vexthulon had replied. "No species could evolve to that level of technological sophistication while maintaining such aggressive tendencies. It's a biological impossibility." They'd watched in fascinated horror as the humans continued their game, displaying levels of athleticism that should have required military-grade genetic enhancement. One human had jumped so high that he'd actually touched the elevated circular target with his hand, causing the other humans to emit loud vocalizations that the universal translator had rendered as "Oh snap!" and "Get dunked on!" The xenobiologist had quietly updated his report to include a note that humans appeared to possess latent flight capabilities and possible reality warping powers. But even the recreational violence had paled in comparison to what they'd discovered about human transportation systems. The Corthaxians had observed with growing alarm as humans climbed into metal containers that moved at high speeds while controlled by individual operators with no apparent central coordination system. The vehicles seemed to follow painted lines on the ground, but these guidelines were frequently ignored in favor of something called changing lanes and making a left turn. The noise generated by these transportation devices was deafening, and the humans seemed to communicate with each other primarily through aggressive honking sounds and creative profanity. The sight of hundreds of these metal death traps hurtling through the streets at barely controlled speeds had convinced the invasion force that they were witnessing some sort of gladiatorial combat system. "They're all armed!" Private Klepnorg Dinglebert had screamed after watching a particularly aggressive taxi driver. "Every single one of them has a personal assault vehicle." The revelation that humans trusted random individuals to operate 2-ton machines at high speeds while surrounded by other humans, doing exactly the same thing, had caused a mass psychological crisis among the Corthaxian command staff. The concept that an entire civilization could function while every citizen possessed what amounted to a portable weapon of mass destruction was so fundamentally terrifying that it had required immediate intervention from the fleet psychiatrist. Dr. Snicksburg Wobblethorpe had prescribed emergency tranquilizers for the entire unit and had submitted a request to High Command for immediate extraction, citing acute exposure to incomprehensible death culture. The request had been denied. The situation had continued to deteriorate when they'd attempted to establish a base of operations in what appeared to be an abandoned building. The structure had seemed suitable for their needs, large, empty, and apparently unoccupied by any humans. What they hadn't realized was that the building was under renovation, which meant that starting at approximately 7 in the morning, it would be invaded by dozens of humans wielding power tools that generated noise levels comparable to a small artillery bombardment. The sound of construction work had proven to be another form of psychological warfare that the humans had apparently developed without realizing it. The combination of hammering, drilling, sawing, and inexplicable banging had created an auditory environment so hostile that it had driven 3 Carthaxians to complete nervous breakdowns within the first hour. Sergeant Blixgorp Mumblebottom had been found hiding in a supply closet, weeping and covering his auditory senses, while muttering, "Why won't they stop? What are they building?" The construction workers, meanwhile, had been perfectly friendly. When they discovered the alien visitors, they'd immediately offered to include them in their morning coffee break, and had spent 20 minutes explaining the finer points of hanging drywall and running electrical conduit. The foreman, a cheerful human named Big Mike Kowalczyk, had been particularly helpful. He'd taken one look at their advanced spacecraft and had immediately offered to hook them up with his brother-in-law, who ran a moving company and could probably give them a good deal on relocating their equipment. "You guys picked a hell of a time to move in," Big Mike had explained, while sharing his thermos of coffee with Lieutenant Mumblethorpe. "We're going to be working on this place for at least 6 months. Hope you don't mind the noise." The casual assumption that they'd want to stick around for 6 months of continuous construction noise had sent Lieutenant Mumblethorpe into a state of shock that had required immediate medical attention. But the construction noise had been nothing compared to their first encounter with human children during school hours. A nearby elementary school had released its students for something called recess, and the Carthaxians had suddenly found themselves surrounded by approximately 300 small humans, engaged in what appeared to be complete and total warfare. The children had been running, screaming, climbing, jumping, and engaging in various activities that seemed designed to cause maximum chaos and confusion. The sound level had been indescribable. The sight of that many young humans moving at high speed while generating maximum noise had convinced the remaining Carthaxian soldiers that they were under attack by some sort of juvenile berserker army. "Incoming!" Corporal Griffnock's Bumbercleat had screamed, diving for cover behind a nearby mailbox as a group of second graders had charged past, chasing a soccer ball and shrieking with laughter. The fact that the adult humans seemed completely unconcerned by this display of juvenile mayhem had only added to the terror. Teachers had stood around casually chatting, while their young charges had engaged in activities that included playing tag, ritualistic hunting practice, hopscotch, combat footwork training, and monkey bars, advanced climbing and traversal techniques. One particularly bold child had approached Private Snorfglig Dinglehopper and had asked if he wanted to play aliens and humans. The irony had not been lost on anyone. "You can be the alien," the child had explained helpfully. "I'll be the human who captures you and takes you to the secret government base." Poor Snorfglig had simply stared at the small human in horror before fainting dead away. The final straw had come when they'd encountered their first human pet owner. The Carthaxians had been conducting a reconnaissance mission through a residential neighborhood when they'd encountered a human female walking what appeared to be a small domesticated predator on a length of rope. The creature was approximately knee-high, covered in fur, and was making enthusiastic panting sounds while occasionally stopping to investigate interesting smells. "Oh my God," the human had exclaimed upon seeing the alien visitors. "Are you guys from that movie they're filming downtown? These costumes are amazing." Before anyone could explain that they weren't costumes, the small predator had approached Sergeant Grumblewise and had begun engaging in behavior that the tactical computer had immediately classified as reconnaissance and threat assessment. The creature had sniffed his boots, circled him twice, and had then committed an act so fundamentally disturbing that it had caused a complete breakdown in interspecies relations. It had licked his hand. The sensation of being marked by predator saliva had sent Sergeant Grumblewise into hysterics. The idea that humans kept small carnivores as companions and allowed them to roam freely through their living spaces while periodically applying biological markers to anything they encountered was so alien to Corthaxian thinking that it had required immediate psychiatric evaluation. "They domesticate their predators," he'd screamed while being loaded onto a medical transport. "They let them live in their homes. The humans are insane." The dog's owner, a pleasant accountant named Jennifer Walsh, had been very apologetic about the whole incident. "I'm so sorry," she'd said, pulling her golden retriever away from the obviously distressed alien. "Bailey's usually very good with strangers. He must really like you." The concept that being liked by a human predator was considered a positive thing had caused a minor philosophical crisis among the remaining soldiers. But even the domesticated predators had been manageable compared to what they'd discovered about human sleeping habits. The Corthaxians had expected that humans, like most civilized species, would become inactive and vulnerable during their rest periods. What they'd found instead was a species that remained partially alert even while unconscious, and whose dwellings were equipped with devices specifically designed to wake them up if anything unusual occurred. The first hint of trouble had come when Private Blexenog Grimblebottom had attempted to conduct a stealth reconnaissance of a typical human dwelling. He'd carefully approached what appeared to be a residential structure, had disabled the external lighting systems, and had begun examining the perimeter for weak points. At which point every light in the neighborhood had suddenly activated. A piercing siren had begun wailing, and approximately 17 humans had emerged from their dwellings armed with various implements and cell phones. "Security system," one of the humans had explained to the obviously confused alien. "Motion sensors, infrared detection, the works. Pretty standard stuff these days." The deal. The revelation that humans had surrounded their sleeping areas with automated defense systems had caused immediate panic among the Corthaxian command staff. The idea that even unconscious humans were protected by electronic sentries was so terrifying that it had required a complete revision of their tactical assessments. But the security systems had been nothing compared to what they'd discovered about human emergency response protocols. Within minutes of the alarm activation, 3 vehicles had arrived, carrying humans in official-looking uniforms who'd immediately begun asking questions about suspicious activity and possible break-in attempts. The humans had been polite but thorough, and had insisted on examining identification documents and filling out incident reports. The police officers had been particularly interested in the Corthaxians' costume party and had wanted to know if they had permits for their special effects equipment. Officer Patricia Rodriguez had been especially helpful, offering to escort them back to their event venue and making sure they had contact information for the appropriate city departments. "You guys are really committed to the act," she'd said admiringly while writing down their information. "Those are some serious prosthetics. You doing a sci-fi convention or something?" The realization that humans had organized response teams trained to investigate unusual activity and equipped with communication networks capable of coordinating citywide alerts had convinced the Corthaxians that they were dealing with a military-industrial complex of staggering sophistication. The fact that these highly trained response specialists had mistaken them for cosplayers had somehow made it even worse. By the end of their first week on Earth, the Corthaxian invasion force had suffered a casualty rate of 73%, with most injuries classified as acute psychological distress or existential breakdown. The remaining soldiers had barricaded themselves inside their landing craft and had refused to come out unless absolutely necessary. Commander Vex Thulon had spent most of his time staring at tactical reports that read like surrealist poetry. The daily situation briefings had become exercises in applied madness. "Sir, we've confirmed that humans regularly consume beverages containing enough caffeine to kill a small Carthaxian. They seem to require this chemical stimulation to function normally. Uji, Private Klepnorg has requested immediate evacuation after witnessing humans voluntarily enter a structure called a haunted house, where other humans jumped out and frightened them for entertainment purposes. The xenobiology team reports that humans routinely expose themselves to harmful solar radiation for cosmetic purposes. They call it getting a tan. Sergeant Blixgorp has suffered a complete breakdown after learning that humans have created an entire industry devoted to making food as spicy as possible. Apparently, causing themselves pain while eating is considered fun. The final crisis had come when they'd made contact with what they'd initially assumed was Earth's governing body, the United Nations. The meeting had been arranged through proper diplomatic channels, and Commander Vex Thulon had prepared extensively for what he'd assumed would be formal surrender negotiations. He'd drafted terms of occupation, prepared resource allocation projections, and had even brought a nice fruit basket as a gesture of goodwill. What he'd found instead was an organization that seemed to exist primarily for the purpose of having very long meetings about having other meetings. The UN delegates had been perfectly polite, but they'd seemed more interested in establishing committees to study the possibility of forming subcommittees to investigate the potential need for additional committees than in actually surrendering their planet. "So," the Secretary-General had said pleasantly, "you're here to conquer Earth?" "Yes," Vex Thulon had replied, somewhat taken aback by the casual tone. "Interesting. Have you filled out the appropriate paperwork? We'll need to refer this to the Security Council, of course, but first we'll need to establish a working group to determine the proper procedures for processing invasion requests. I'm thinking we start with a feasibility study, then maybe an environmental impact assessment." The revelation that humans had created a bureaucratic system so complex that it could potentially delay their own conquest indefinitely had caused Vex Thulon to experience what military psychologists later classified as administrative vertigo. The meeting had continued for 6 hours, during which time absolutely nothing had been decided, except that they'd need to schedule another meeting to discuss scheduling future meetings. The humans had taken extensive notes, had created several action items, and had promised to circle back on the invasion question once they'd had a chance to run it up the flagpole and see where the various stakeholders landed on the issue. By the time Vex Thulon had escaped from the conference room, he'd been seriously considering the possibility that humans had somehow weaponized parliamentary procedure. The breaking point had come during their second week, when they'd attempted to establish a supply line by shopping for basic necessities at a human commercial establishment. The experience of entering a Walmart supercenter had proven to be the final psychological straw for the invasion force. The sheer scale of the operation had been overwhelming. A single building the size of a small city, filled with more products than existed on most civilized worlds, all organized according to principles that defied rational analysis. The fluorescent lighting had been bad enough, the muzak had been worse, but the real horror had come from observing human shopping behavior. Families had wandered through the aisles, pushing metal carts filled with enough supplies to sustain a small army, casually selecting from thousands of different options for every conceivable need. The variety had been staggering. 17 different types of breakfast cereal, 43 varieties of shampoo, and an entire aisle devoted exclusively to products designed to make things smell different than they naturally smelled. Private Grexnim Booger Flipper had suffered a complete breakdown in the personal hygiene section after discovering that humans had created over 200 different products for the sole purpose of making their teeth white and their breath smell like mint. The concept that an entire industry existed to address problems that most species didn't even know they had caused what the medical team later classified as consumer culture shock. Boo. But the personal hygiene products had been nothing compared to the horror of the checkout process. The Carthaxians had watched in fascinated terror as humans waited in long lines to have their purchases scanned by other humans who seemed to be engaged in some sort of ritualistic evaluation process. Each item had been individually examined, processed through a mysterious scanning device, and then placed in thin plastic containers that were apparently designed to tear open at the slightest provocation. The cashier, a cheerful teenager named Ashley Martinez, had tried to make conversation while processing their purchases. "Did you find everything you were looking for today?" she'd asked, while scanning a bottle of what the Carthaxians hoped was suitable nourishment. The question had caused immediate panic. The implication that they might not have found everything suggested that there were additional products available somewhere in the vast commercial complex that they'd failed to locate. The possibility that they'd missed important supplies due to inadequate reconnaissance had sent Lieutenant Mumblethorpe into a spiral of logistical anxiety. "Paper or plastic?" Ashley had continued, apparently unaware that she'd just triggered a minor military crisis. The choice between two different container options for transporting their purchases had required a hasty consultation with the supply officer, 3 different risk assessments, and a brief argument about relative load-bearing capacities. Plastic, I guess," Vextulon had eventually managed. Ashley had smiled and had begun loading their purchases into the flimsy containers while chatting about the weather, her college classes, and whether they'd heard about the sale on frozen pizza in aisle 7. The casual revelation that they'd missed a significant discount opportunity had caused Sergeant Grumblewise to make small, whimpering sounds. But the real breakdown had come when Ashley had announced their total. "That'll be 247,083s. Indeed, the concept that humans had created a complex mathematical system for determining the relative value of goods and services, and that successful completion of commercial transactions required precise calculation of numerical exchanges, had overwhelmed the Carthaxian economic analysis systems. The fact that Ashley had performed these calculations instantly while maintaining cheerful conversation had convinced everyone present that all humans possessed advanced mathematical processing capabilities. The discovery that Earth's economy was managed by millions of individual humans, each capable of performing complex financial calculations while engaging in social interaction and consuming entertainment media simultaneously, had required immediate revision of their intelligence estimates. "Sir," the xenopsychologist had reported that evening, "we may have seriously underestimated their computational abilities. That female juvenile processed 17 different transactions, calculated tax percentages, provided customer service, and discussed her academic pursuits, all while maintaining peak efficiency. Our best battle computers can't multitask at that level." The final humiliation had come when they'd attempted to pay for their purchases using standard galactic currency, only to discover that humans insisted on using their own primitive monetary system based on small metal discs and rectangular pieces of paper covered with portraits of deceased political leaders. The fact that human commerce was based on physical tokens that could be easily counterfeited, lost, or damaged had convinced the Carthaxians that Earth's economic system was either incredibly sophisticated or completely insane, possibly both. Ashley had been very understanding about the whole situation and had called her manager over to help sort things out. The manager, a patient middle-aged human named Bob Thompson, had explained that they'd need to use legal tender to complete their transaction, but had offered to help them find the nearest bank where they could exchange their foreign currency. The suggestion that their advanced galactic credits might be considered foreign currency had caused a philosophical crisis that had required immediate intervention from the fleet chaplain. By the time they'd finally completed their shopping expedition, half the invasion force had been reduced to catatonic shock, and the other half had begun showing signs of what the medical officer diagnosed as acute retail trauma syndrome. The breaking point had finally come during their third week on Earth, when they'd encountered something that had shattered their understanding of human psychology so completely that it had required immediate evacuation of all personnel: a human birthday party. The event had taken place in the park where they'd originally landed, and the Corthaxians had initially assumed they were witnessing some sort of religious ceremony. A group of humans had gathered around a small table, had lit small flames on top of a decorated food item, and had begun chanting in unison while a juvenile human closed her eyes and made some sort of wish. The ritual had seemed harmless enough until the birthday girl had opened her eyes and had blown out the flames, causing all the assembled humans to erupt in loud vocalizations of approval and celebration. What happened next had broken something fundamental in the Corthaxian worldview. The humans had proceeded to distribute portions of the food item to everyone present, including complete strangers who had wandered over to see what was happening. The birthday girl's parents had invited the confused alien observers to join the celebration, had offered them cake and ice cream, and had insisted on taking photographs to commemorate the special day. The sight of humans voluntarily sharing food with unknown entities, simply because those entities happened to be present during a celebratory ritual, had caused what the xenocultural anthropologist later described as acute comprehension failure. They're sharing their food, Private Klepnorg had whispered in horror. With strangers, for no reason. The concept that predators would voluntarily distribute their resources to individuals outside their pack structure without any expectation of reciprocity or alliance building had challenged every fundamental assumption about intelligent behavior that the Corthaxians possessed. But even that had been manageable compared to what happened when they'd learned about the presence. The birthday girl had been given a collection of wrapped packages by the other humans, each containing items that she hadn't requested and didn't necessarily need. The other humans had seemed to derive genuine pleasure from watching her unwrap these gifts, and she had expressed gratitude for each one, regardless of its practical utility. The revelation that humans regularly gave each other objects for no reason other than to express affection and celebrate the arbitrary anniversary of someone's birth had caused a complete breakdown in Corthaxian economic theory. The concept of a gift-based economy that operated parallel to their commercial system was so alien that it had required emergency consultation with the fleet's philosophical advisors. The final straw had come when the birthday girl had approached Commander Vexthulon and had offered him a piece of her cake. "Here," she'd said, holding out a paper plate with a generous slice covered in bright blue frosting. "It's my birthday, so everyone gets cake." The casual generosity of a human juvenile sharing her celebratory food with a heavily armed alien invader had caused Vexthulon to experience what could only be described as a complete existential meltdown. The idea that their enemies were trying to feed them birthday cake was so fundamentally contrary to everything he understood about warfare, conquest, and basic survival instincts that his brain had simply stopped processing information normally. He'd stood there, holding a paper plate covered in blue frosting, while a 6-year-old human explained that the cake was vanilla with buttercream and that she'd helped Mummy make it herself. The child had then skipped away to distribute more cake, leaving the commander of a galactic invasion force staring at a dessert and questioning every life choice that had brought him to this moment. "Sir," Lieutenant Mumblethorpe had approached cautiously, Should we analyze the food item for toxins?" "No," Vexthulon had whispered, watching the birthday girl offer cake to a complete stranger who'd been walking his dog through the park. I don't think they're trying to poison us," Mumblethorpe. "Then what are they doing, sir?" Vexthulon had taken a small bite of the cake. It had been, he'd realized with growing horror, delicious. "I think," he'd said slowly, "they're being nice to us." The implications had been staggering. If humans were capable of showing kindness to obvious enemies, what did that say about their strategic thinking? If they could maintain their generous nature while simultaneously developing weapons of mass destruction and global surveillance networks, what kind of psychological profile were they dealing with? The xenopsychologist had later filed a report stating that humans appeared to suffer from acute cognitive dissonance and possibly terminal optimism. The recommendation had been immediate extraction before the entire invasion force succumbed to what he'd termed aggressive friendliness syndrome. But High Command had refused the evacuation request, insisting that a species capable of making vanilla with buttercream couldn't possibly pose a serious military threat. That had been before they'd learned about human news media. The Corthaxians had made the mistake of monitoring Earth's information networks, reasoning that intelligence gathering was a standard part of any occupation force. What they'd discovered had challenged their understanding of information warfare so completely that it had required emergency psychological support for the entire communications team. Humans, it turned out, had created a global information system that operated on principles that defied logical analysis. Instead of a centralized, efficient distribution network, they developed thousands of competing sources that frequently contradicted each other, often within the same broadcast. The morning news had been particularly devastating to Corthaxian morale. They'd watched in fascination as human information specialists had reported on weather patterns, political developments, economic indicators, and celebrity gossip with equal levels of apparent urgency and concern. Today's top story, the news anchor had announced cheerfully, a local cat has learned to open doors, causing minor chaos in the Pemberton household. We'll have live coverage after this brief word from our sponsors. The revelation that humans considered a domesticated feline's door-opening abilities worthy of live coverage had caused immediate confusion among the intelligence analysis team. The concept that a species with global communication networks would use them to report on pet behavior had challenged every assumption about information prioritization. But the pet stories had been nothing compared to the weather reports. Humans, the Corthaxians had discovered, were obsessed with atmospheric conditions to a degree that bordered on pathological. They had entire teams of specialists whose job was to predict future weather patterns, and they treated these predictions with the sort of reverence typically reserved for military intelligence or diplomatic communications. Tomorrow's forecast calls for partly cloudy skies with a 30% chance of rain, the weather specialist had announced, pointing at a series of colorful charts that displayed information with NASA-level precision. High of 72, low of 58. Don't forget your umbrella. The idea that humans needed advanced meteorological analysis to determine whether to carry portable rain protection had convinced the Corthaxians that Earth's atmospheric conditions must be incredibly volatile and dangerous. The fact that humans ventured outside, despite constant uncertainty about weather patterns, had been added to their growing list of evidence for humanity's suicidal tendencies. But even the weather obsession had been manageable compared to what they discovered about human advertising. The Corthaxians had been completely unprepared for the concept of commercial propaganda designed to convince people to purchase products they didn't need by appealing to emotions they didn't know they had. The sophistication of human psychological manipulation techniques had been genuinely terrifying. They'd watched in horror as advertisers had used advanced behavioral psychology to convince humans that consuming carbonated sugar water would make them more attractive, that wearing specific clothing brands would improve their social status, and that purchasing particular automobiles would somehow enhance their masculinity or femininity. These aren't just advertisements, the psychological warfare specialist had reported, his voice shaking with professional admiration. This is applied mind control at a level we've never encountered. They're using color psychology, subliminal messaging, social pressure, fear of inadequacy, and neurological reward triggers, all in 30-second packages. The discovery that humans had developed psychological manipulation techniques so sophisticated that they'd convinced their own species to voluntarily participate in a consumer economy had forced a complete revision of their threat assessment. Any species capable of that level of mental influence was clearly far more dangerous than they'd initially assumed. But the real horror had come when they'd realized that humans seemed to enjoy being manipulated by their own advertising. They'd sung along with commercial jingles, had quoted advertising slogans, and had actually formed emotional attachments to corporate mascots. The sight of adult humans expressing genuine affection for animated characters whose sole purpose was to sell them breakfast cereal had convinced the Carthaxians that they were dealing with a form of mass psychosis that was somehow functional and self-sustaining. Sir, Private Snorfglig had reported after monitoring children's television programming, they've created cartoon characters that exist solely to convince juveniles to consume sugar-based nutrition substitutes. And the juveniles love them. They're singing songs about a rabbit that wants them to eat colored pellets. The concept that humans had developed a system for psychologically conditioning their own offspring to desire specific commercial products had been the final piece of evidence that Earth's population was suffering from some sort of species-wide mental disorder. The evacuation request had been filed that same day. This time, High Command had taken the request more seriously, especially after reviewing the cultural analysis reports that had been flooding in from the observation teams. The xenoanthropologist had submitted a particularly disturbing report about human recreational activities that had required immediate classification at the highest security levels. Subject species engages in voluntary physical stress activities for entertainment purposes. Observed behaviors include deliberately placing themselves in confined spaces with dangerous animals, zoos, intentionally frightening themselves for pleasure, horror movies, voluntarily subjecting themselves to extreme physical discomfort, exercise, and paying money to be transported at high speeds through deliberately dangerous mechanical contraptions, roller coasters. Additional concerning behaviors include consuming ethanol-based toxins until their cognitive functions are impaired, drinking, exposing themselves to dangerous levels of solar radiation, sunbathing, and participating in competitive activities designed to cause physical exhaustion and potential injury, sports. Conclusion. Subject species appears to suffer from pathological risk-seeking behavior and possible species-wide masochistic tendencies. Recommend immediate psychological evaluation of all personnel who have had extended contact with human subjects. The medical officer had filed a supplementary report that had been even more disturbing. Human physiological capabilities exceed all previous estimates. Observed subjects routinely survive and recover from injuries that would be fatal to most galactic species. Subject tolerance for pain, stress, and environmental extremes suggests possible military enhancement or genetic modification programs. Additionally, humans appear to possess redundant biological systems and extraordinary adaptive capabilities. They continue to function normally despite consuming substances that would be toxic to Carthaxian physiology, operating on insufficient sleep cycles, and maintaining stress levels that should cause immediate psychological breakdown. Most concerning, humans seem to thrive under conditions that would be considered torture by galactic standards. They voluntarily expose themselves to extreme temperatures, loud noises, bright lights, and social stress, then report feeling refreshed and energized by these experiences. Recommendation: reclassify humans as a potential biological weapon and avoid all unnecessary contact. But the final report that had convinced High Command to authorize emergency evacuation had come from the social dynamics specialist. Human social organization defies all known models of intelligent species behavior. They have simultaneously developed global communication networks and tribal conflict systems. They share resources with strangers while maintaining competitive economic structures. They create art, celebrating peace, while engineering increasingly efficient weapons of war. Most disturbing. They appear to be aware of their own contradictory nature and find it amusing. They make jokes about their own psychological inconsistencies and seem to derive entertainment from their species' inability to behave rationally. They have created an entire entertainment industry based on satirizing their own dysfunctional behavior patterns. They voluntarily consume media that highlights their flaws, then laugh about it with other humans who suffer from identical flaws. Conclusion: human psychology is so fundamentally alien that continued exposure may cause permanent damage to Carthaxian mental health. The species appears to have evolved beyond the need for logical consistency and may represent a form of collective intelligence that operates on principles we cannot comprehend. Urgent recommendation: complete evacuation of all personnel before exposure to human humor causes irreversible cognitive damage. The evacuation order had been issued within hours of receiving these reports. The extraction process had been a logistical nightmare that had somehow managed to be even more humiliating than the original invasion. The humans had been incredibly helpful with the evacuation, offering to assist with loading equipment, providing recommendations for local moving companies, and insisting on throwing a farewell party for their space friends. The farewell party had been the final insult. The same humans who had unwittingly terrorized a galactic invasion force into complete psychological surrender had organized a potluck dinner to wish them well on their journey home. They'd brought casseroles, potato salad, and something called brownies that had been so delicious that several Carthaxian soldiers had wept openly while eating them. "We're really going to miss you guys," Jennifer Walsh had said, while her golden retriever had attempted to mark Commander Vexthalon's boots one final time. "It's been so fun having visitors from space. You'll have to come back and visit sometime." The casual invitation to return for a social visit had caused Vexthalon to experience what the medical team had later classified as terminal irony poisoning. Dave Kowalski had presented them with a certificate of appreciation from the Parks Department, thanking them for their unique contribution to community diversity and noting that their temporary permit application had been approved, so they were welcome to return anytime they wanted to hold another cultural exchange event. Big Mike Kowalczyk had given them his business card and had offered to give them a discount on any future construction projects they might need, because space friends look out for each other. Ashley Martinez had hugged Lieutenant Mumblethorpe goodbye and had made him promise to write, despite the fact that intergalactic postal service didn't exist and probably never would. The birthday girl had given Commander Vexthalon a drawing she'd made of him eating cake, which he'd carefully stored in his personal effects and would later frame in his office as a reminder of the strangest military defeat in galactic history. As their evacuation craft had lifted off from Central Park, the assembled humans had waved goodbye and had shouted messages of encouragement for their journey home. Several had held up signs reading "Safe travels and come back soon," as if the retreating alien invasion force was a group of exchange students heading back to college. The final transmission from Earth had come from the UN Secretary General, who had wanted to thank them for their patience with our bureaucratic processes, and to let them know that the committee to study the formation of a subcommittee to investigate alien invasion protocols had scheduled their first meeting for sometime next spring. "We understand you couldn't wait for the official approval process," the Secretary General had said cheerfully, "but please know that Earth's door is always open for future diplomatic missions. Just remember to bring your paperwork next time." Commander Vexthalon had spent the return journey to Carthaxian space staring out the viewport at the receding blue planet, trying to process what had happened to his military career. He'd been defeated not by superior firepower or advanced technology, but by a species that had somehow evolved beyond the need for logical behavior while maintaining the innocent belief that everyone they met was probably a nice person who just needed a friend and a good meal. The debriefing sessions had lasted for months and had required the assistance of 17 different psychological specialists, 6 philosophical advisors, and 3 religious counselors. The final report had been classified at the highest security levels and had been distributed only to the most senior levels of galactic government. The official conclusion had been that Earth was to be designated as a cultural hazard zone and marked off-limits to all military personnel, diplomatic missions, and tourist expeditions until further notice. The recommendation had been unanimous. Humans were simply too psychologically dangerous for normal contact protocols. The Galactic Council had accepted the recommendation without debate, especially after reviewing the psychological evaluation reports for the returned invasion force. 63% of the soldiers had required extended therapy. 22% had requested career changes to something less stressful, like bomb disposal or black hole navigation, and the remaining 15% had developed an inexplicable fondness for small domestic animals and birthday cake. Commander Vex Thulon had submitted his resignation the day after returning to base, citing acute exposure to incomprehensible optimism as grounds for medical discharge. His final report had consisted of a single sentence: "They tried to give us cake." The file had been sealed and archived in the Galactic Military Archives, where it would remain as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating a species based on their apparent technological limitations. A note had been attached to Earth's stellar cartography entry. Warning: inhabitants are armed with excessive friendliness and may attempt to feed visitors. Approach with extreme caution. The legend of Earth had spread quietly through the galactic community, whispered among military personnel, as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who didn't realize they were supposed to be enemies at all. The story had become required reading at the Galactic War College, studied as an example of how psychological warfare could be deployed accidentally by a species that thought they were just being polite. Years later, xenopsychologists would still debate whether humans had somehow evolved a perfect defense mechanism against conquest, or whether they were simply too psychologically alien for normal military strategies to be effective. The consensus had eventually settled on a third possibility: that humans represented a form of intelligence so fundamentally different from the galactic norm that contact with them posed an existential threat to the sanity of other species. Earth remained on the restricted worlds list, monitored from a safe distance by automated sensors and the occasional long-range observation post. The humans continued their daily lives, completely unaware that they had successfully repelled a galactic invasion force through the simple act of being themselves. And somewhere in a filing cabinet at the UN headquarters in New York, there was still a stack of forms for application for large-scale planetary occupation permits that someone had filled out in shaky handwriting and never returned for processing. The galaxy, it seemed, would have to find other planets to conquer, because Earth was simply too dangerous to approach safely, not because the humans were hostile, but because they were the kind of species that would invite you to stay for dinner and somehow convince you that conquering their planet was probably more trouble than it was worth anyway. After all, who wants to rule a world where the inhabitants might try to throw you a welcome party?